It began as a celebration of success, 9 friends, high-pressure careers, and a collective need for escape in a golden cage of luxury. They believed their privilege was a shield, that tragedy was a stranger who only visited the lives of others. But on the 3rd of May, under the cover of a routine that felt unbreakable, the unthinkable slipped through an unlocked door. The bed was empty. The window was open, and the scream that followed would tear the veneer of their perfect holiday apart, launching the most expensive, controversial, and baffling manhunt in history. Was it a predator stalking from the shadows, or was the answer sitting at the dinner table all along? We are about to step back into the darkness of apartment 5A to unravel the timeline, the secrets, and the lies. This is a story where the silence speaks louder than words. Before we begin this investigation, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep the search for the truth alive. Now, let us enter the golden cage. The decision to travel to the southern coast of Portugal was driven by a collective need for escape. For this group of friends, all successful medical professionals from England, the holiday was meant to be a release valve for the high-pressure lives they led back home. They arrived in the spring of 2007 with an air of confident authority, a group of 9 adults and 8 little ones moving as a single, self-contained unit. They carried with them an invisible shield of privilege, a subconscious belief that tragedy was something that happened to the patients they treated, not to people like them. They chose the Ocean Club not for its scenery, but for its containment. It promised a controlled environment, a place where the chaos of parenting could be managed within the boundaries of a resort. However, as they settled into their ground-floor apartments, the layout offered a deceptive sense of security. Apartment 5, situated at the corner of the block, felt private, yet it was dangerously exposed to the public road. The group did not see the risk. They only saw the convenience. The patio doors at the rear offered a shortcut to the swimming pool and the restaurant, a shortcut that would soon become the most scrutinized pathway in criminal history. From the very first night, a distinct separation emerged between the adults and their surroundings. They were physically in a foreign country, but mentally, they remained in a bubble of British familiarity. They did not integrate. They occupied. This isolation bred a dangerous complacency. The sharp instincts that might have alerted them to danger in a city back home were dulled by the sun and the false safety of the resort. They let their guard down, assuming that the gates and the reception desk were impenetrable barriers against the outside world. The friction of parenting was palpable. With so many young dependents to care for, the noise and the demands were constant. The mothers and fathers were exhausted, craving the hours of the evening when the little one would sleep and they could return to being adults. This desire for separation led to the fateful decision regarding the listening service. The resort offered a night service, a secure room where staff would watch the younger members of the group. The group rejected it. They argued that it would disrupt the little one's routine. But the psychological truth was likely simpler. They wanted to dine close by, to maintain the illusion of being present parents while enjoying the freedom of an adult-only dinner. They devised a patrol system, a roster of checks that allowed them to leave the rooms unattended while the occupants slept inside while they ate at the tapas bar. It was a system built on the arrogance of probability, the belief that in the short window of 20 or 30 minutes between checks, nothing catastrophic could possibly happen. They convinced themselves that they were responsible, that a quick listen at the door or a glance into the room was sufficient guardianship. They did not lock the patio doors because carrying keys was an inconvenience. Convenience was prioritized over security at every turn. In the days leading up to the end of the week, small cracks appeared in this routine. The little one were unsettled. The mother in apartment 5 mentioned that the twins had cried the night before, confused by their parents' absence. It was a warning sign, a signal that the system was flawed, but it was ignored. The adults were too entrenched in their holiday mode to pivot. They trusted the silence of the resort. They trusted the darkness. They did not realize that silence could be exploited, and that darkness could hide a perpetrator just as easily as it hid their negligence. On the evening of Thursday, the 3rd of May, the group converged on the Tapas restaurant around 8:30. The venue was tantalizingly close to the apartments, yet visually obstructed. From where they sat, they could not see the doors they had left unlocked. They were dining in a blind spot. The table was loud, a dominant force in the small, open-air restaurant. Bottles of wine were uncorked, and the conversation swelled, creating a sonic barrier that isolated them further from the sleeping little one. The checking routine began as it had on previous nights. Just after 9 o'clock, the father from apartment 5 left the table. He walked the short distance to the apartment, entering through the rear patio doors. The unit was quiet. He walked into the little one's bedroom. The door was ajar, positioned carefully to let in a sliver of light. He saw the shapes of his 3 sleeping family members. The youngest were in their travel cots. She was in her bed. He paused, listening for the rhythm of their breathing. Satisfied that the stillness meant safety, he left without a further glance. He did not check the window. He did not check the wardrobe. He assumed presence based on a silhouette. On his return to the restaurant, the father stopped to speak with a friend in the narrow street. They stood there for several minutes, chatting casually in the cool night air. This conversation would later be dissected by investigators for years. While they stood there, occupying the space between the restaurant and the apartment, the timeline split. Was the abductor already inside, freezing in the shadows as the father's voice drifted through the window? Or did they slip past in the moments after the men returned to their wine? The street felt empty, but the feeling of being watched was absent, replaced by the dull comfort of routine. Around 9:30, another member of the group volunteered to check. He approached apartment 5A but did not enter. He stood outside the patio doors, listening for the sound of crying. Hearing nothing, he turned back. This was the moment the system failed completely. He assumed that silence equaled safety. He did not verify that the little one were actually there. He reported back to the table that all was well, a statement that was factually unknown. The clock moved toward 10 o'clock. It was the mother's turn. She rose from the table, perhaps feeling a sudden instinctual pull, or perhaps simply following the schedule. She retraced the steps her husband had taken an hour before. As she entered the apartment through the patio doors, the atmosphere struck her immediately. It was not just quiet, it was cold. A draft swept through the living room, slamming the door to the little one's bedroom shut. Fear spiked in her chest. They never opened the windows. She moved to the bedroom door, pushing it open against the draft. Her eyes went to the travel cots. First the twins were sleeping. Then her gaze shifted to the bed against the wall. It was empty. Her mind raced to find a logical explanation. Had the victim woken up? Had she wandered into the parents' bed? The mother rushed to her own room. Empty. She checked the bathroom. Empty. She returned to the little one's room, and this time, the reality of the scene shattered her denial. The curtains were blowing wildly. The window was wide open. The heavy metal shutters had been forced up. The victim was not wandering. She was not hiding. The space where she had lain was vacant. The soft toy she slept with every night abandoned on the mattress. The mother did not search further. The instinct to flee, to scream, took over. She ran back out through the patio doors, leaving the apartment open to the night. She sprinted toward the lights of the restaurant, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her friends saw her expression before she reached the table. It was a look of primal devastation. She did not need to explain. She screamed a single sentence that cut through the laughter and the clinking of glasses, a sentence that would end their lives as they knew them. "She is gone." The reaction was immediate chaos. Chairs were overturned. The veneer of the relaxed holidaymakers vanished, replaced by the frantic terror of parents realizing their worst nightmare had materialized while they sat drinking wine just meters away. The golden cage was broken. The routine was destroyed. And in the distance, Beyond the panic and the screams, the ocean remained silent, keeping its secrets in the dark. The scream that shattered the peace of the resort was not merely a sound, it was a detonation. In the seconds following the mother's declaration, the social cohesion of the dinner party disintegrated. The table was abandoned, chairs toppling onto the pavement as the group sprinted toward apartment 5A. The distance, which had felt so short and convenient only moments before, now stretched out like a nightmare corridor. Every step was heavy with the terrifying realization that their system of checks had failed in the most catastrophic way possible. The father reached the apartment first, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst through the patio doors, the same doors he had left unlocked for efficiency, now standing as a mocking testament to that decision. He ran straight to the little one's bedroom. The visual was stark and undeniable. The bed against the wall was vacant. The pillow was unpressed. The small, soft cat that his little one held every night was lying alone on the mattress. Chaos descended upon the small apartment. The friends poured in behind the father, filling the small space with frantic energy. The air was thick with panic. They began to search, but it was a search born of denial rather than logic. They looked in places a victim could not possibly be. They tore open the wardrobes, checked under the beds, and pulled back the curtains. They shouted her name, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of desperation. In this frenzy, the crime scene was effectively destroyed within minutes. The window became the immediate focus of the confusion. The mother was adamant. She stood trembling in the center of the room, pointing at the window. She insisted that when she entered, the window was wide open and the heavy exterior shutter was raised completely. She claimed the curtains were whipping in a draft. However, in the chaos of the search, the father or perhaps one of the friends had closed it, or touched it, or manipulated the mechanism to see how it worked. Hands were everywhere. They touched the window frame, the glass, the shutter strap, and the door handles. In their desperate attempt to find the victim, they were unknowingly layering their own fingerprints over any trace an intruder might have left. The forensic timeline was being corrupted in real time. If a predator had touched that windowsill, that evidence was now being smeared by the sweating, shaking hands of the panic-stricken guests. The group split up. Some ran outside to search the immediate vicinity. They checked the bushes, the stairwells, and the dark corners of the resort complex. The darkness, which had been a comforting blanket for their dinner, was now an enemy. Every shadow looked like a hiding place. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a footstep. Back inside the apartment, the reality of the situation began to solidify into a cold, hard knot in the stomach of the father. He realized that the wandering off theory did not hold water. The shutters were heavy, metal slats. A person of such small stature could not raise them. Even if she had managed to climb out of the window, she would have had to close the heavy shutters behind her. An impossible physical feat for someone so small. The conclusion was terrifyingly simple. Someone else had been there. The alarm was raised with the resort staff. The reception desk, usually a place of polite inquiries and towel exchanges, became a command center for the panic. Staff members, confused and sleepy, were mobilized. They joined the search, using flashlights to sweep the swimming pool area. This was the darkest fear of every parent, the water. The father ran to the pool, staring into the dark, chlorinated depths, praying not to see a small shape at the bottom. The water was clear. She was not there. As the search radius expanded, so did the contamination. More people entered the apartment. Staff members, other tourists, and well-meaning strangers walked through the living room and the bedroom. They trampled the floor where footprints might have been. They touched surfaces. The apartment, which should have been sealed off as a sterile zone of investigation, became a thoroughfare of hysteria. The mother remained in the apartment, consumed by a visceral grief. She began to suspect everyone. She looked at the faces of the people crowding into her holiday home, faces of staff, strangers, even friends, and wondered if the monster was standing right there in the room. The trust that held their world together had evaporated, replaced by a suffocating paranoia. The open window had let the night in, and with it, a darkness that would never leave them. Time works differently in a crisis. The minutes that passed between the raising of the alarm and the arrival of the police felt like hours. The group waited, pacing the pavement, their eyes scanning the dark roads, expecting a cavalry. They expected sirens, flashing lights, a swarm of uniformed officers sealing the perimeter and launching a military-grade operation. They expected the response they would have received in London. What they got was 2 officers from the local GNR, the National Republican Guard. The officers arrived in a patrol car, looking not like the saviors the parents had envisioned, but like men responding to a noise complaint. They walked slowly. They did not have their guns drawn. They did not have tracking dogs. The language barrier rose immediately like a brick wall. The parents spoke rapid, frantic English, fueled by adrenaline and terror. The officers spoke Portuguese, their demeanor calm, almost dismissive. From the perspective of the police, the scenario was routine. In a holiday resort, late at night, a victim is reported missing. The statistical probability was overwhelming. The victim had woken up, found the parents gone, wandered out looking for them, and fallen asleep in a bush or a neighboring garden. They did not see a crime scene. They saw a domestic oversight. The clash of narratives was violent. The parents were screaming abduction and taken. The police were saying wandered and search. The father tried to explain the shutters, the window, the impossibility of her leaving on her own. The officers nodded but did not seem to grasp the urgency of the evidence. They did not seal the apartment immediately. They allowed the crowd to continue milling about. This was the loss of the golden hour. In any abduction case, the first 60 minutes are critical. It is the time when the trail is hot, when the perpetrator is likely still within a certain radius, and when evidence is fresh. But those 60 minutes were bleeding away in a haze of translation errors and cultural misunderstandings. While the parents pleaded for roadblocks, for the borders to Spain to be closed, the officers were radioing for backup that was slow to arrive. The border was less than 2 hours away. A car traveling at speed could have already crossed it. The silent ocean that bordered the town was not the only escape route. The open roads of Europe lay to the east. The perpetrator had a massive head start, and the police were still looking under sun loungers by the pool. The search expanded into the streets of Praia da Luz. The name of the town translates to Beach of Light, but that night it was a labyrinth of shadows. The friends and staff fanned out, calling her name. They looked in trash bins, a task that required a stomach-turning level of courage. They looked in the unfinished construction sites that littered the edge of the town. They looked down wells. The parents felt a growing sense of impotence. They were high-achieving doctors, people used to giving orders and having them followed. They were used to systems working. Here, the system was broken. They were at the mercy of a small-town police force that seemed ill-equipped to handle a major crime. The father began to call back home, waking up friends and family in England, begging for advice, for contacts, for anything that could cut through the inertia of the local response. By 3 or 4 in the morning, the specialized police, the Judiciaria, finally arrived. These were the detectives, the men in suits. But by then, the damage was done. The scene was compromised. The trail was cold. The initial officers had not taken witness statements immediately. They had not separated the friends to ensure their stories remained uninfluenced by one another. The group had spent hours talking, crying, and rationalizing together, inadvertently fusing their memories into a collective narrative. As the sun began to rise over the Algarve, casting a pale, indifferent light on the white walls of the resort, the reality set in. The night was over, but the darkness remained. The police tape was finally going up, fluttering in the morning breeze. But it was too little, too late. The golden cage had been breached, the golden hour had been squandered, and the victim was gone. The machinery of a massive international investigation was slowly grinding into gear. But the crucial sparks of the beginning had been extinguished by delay and disbelief. The parents stood in the dawn light, staring at the empty road, realizing that their little one was being carried further away with every ticking second of the clock. The arrival of the Criminal Investigation Department marked a distinct shift in the atmosphere. The local uniformed officers, who had spent the night wandering the perimeter with flashlights and good intentions, stepped back. In their place came men in suits, men who did not carry the apologetic air of the resort staff, but rather the heavy, cynical weight of homicide and major crime experience. Leading them was the chief inspector, a man whose career had been built on reading the darkest corners of human behavior. He walked into apartment 5 and not with the frantic energy of the parents, but with a slow, calculating stillness. To him, the apartment was not a holiday home. It was a grid of potential evidence, and his first observation was one of professional despair. The scene had been trampled. He saw the scuff marks of dozens of shoes on the tiled floor. He saw surfaces that had been wiped or touched. The sanctity of the crime scene, the silent witness that usually speaks to detectives, had been shouted down by the chaos of the night. His eyes moved to the window. The parents insisted it had been forced. The shutters jemmied open to allow an abductor entry and exit. The inspector examined the mechanism. The metal shutters were heavy, designed to keep out the harsh midday sun and potential intruders. They locked from the inside. There was no damage to the metalwork, no scar marks on the exterior paint that would suggest a crowbar or a screwdriver. To open them from the outside without destroying them was technically impossible. To open them from the inside required human knowledge and strength. He turned his attention to the parents. They were huddled in a nearby apartment, surrounded by their friends. The inspector watched them through the glass of the patio doors before he spoke to them. He was looking for the raw, unpolished signs of grief he had seen in hundreds of other cases. Usually, parents of missing little one are incapacitated by shock. They are incoherent, unable to stand, broken by the visceral reality of loss. What he saw here was different. There was grief, certainly, but there was also organization. The father was already talking about media strategies, about contacting news outlets back in England. The mother was clutching the soft toy, her face a mask of trauma, but her eyes were scanning the room, alert and sharp. They were doctors, he reminded himself. They were trained to compartmentalize, to function in high-stress environments where life and death were managed with clinical detachment. But this was not a patient. This was their flesh and blood. The disconnect between their professional composure and the personal horror unsettled him. The interrogation began not in a formal interview room, but in the makeshift chaos of the resort. The language barrier was a thick fog. The inspector spoke limited English. The parents spoke no Portuguese. Interpreters were brought in, but nuance is often lost in translation. The inspector asked about the routine, the checks, the timeline. He listened to the story of the unlocked door. He felt the pressure mounting almost immediately. The British consul was already involved. The media vans were arriving, parking on the scrubland outside the apartment, their satellite dishes pointing toward the sky like accusing fingers. This was not going to be a local investigation. The inspector realized he was working under a microscope. Every question he asked was treated by the friends, not as a necessary part of the investigation, but as an insult. They closed ranks. They were a tribe, protective and defensive, treating the police as an inconvenience rather than an authority. The inspector walked back to the window. He stood where the abductor supposedly stood. He tried to visualize the act. A stranger entering a room with sleeping occupants, lifting a sleeping form, and climbing back out of a window 4 feet off the ground. all without waking the others in the room or making a sound loud enough to be heard by the adults dining nearby. It was a physical puzzle that did not fit. The risk was astronomical. The reward was obscure. He stepped outside into the cool morning air. He lit a cigarette, a habit he had tried to quit but which always returned with the dead bodies. He looked at the layout of the streets. It was too open, too public. Yet, the narrative being presented to him was one of a phantom who moved through walls. He knew then that the battle would not just be to find the victim, but to fight the narrative that was already hardening like concrete around the case. The parents were controlling the story, and he was merely a character in their script. He exhaled the smoke, deciding in that moment that he would not follow their script. He would follow the evidence, even if it led him to places no one wanted to go. The investigation moved from the physical scene to the reconstruction of time. The detective sat down with the group, the 9 adults who had dined together, to piece together the events of the evening. This group, later known by the media as the Tapas 7, provided statements that were meant to solidify the timeline. Instead, they created a labyrinth of contradictions. The timeline was the backbone of the abduction theory. The parents and their friends claimed that the little one were never left alone for long periods. They described a relay system, a constant flow of adults checking on the sleeping occupants. But as the inspector laid out the statements side by side, the math began to fail. The first major crack appeared in the timing of the checks. One friend claimed to have listened at the door at 9:30. He stated the apartment was silent. Another friend claimed to have seen the father of the missing victim chatting in the street at that exact same time. If the friend was listening at the door, how did he not see the father standing just meters away? The geography of the small resort made invisibility impossible. Then came the sighting that would become the cornerstone of the investigation, and later, its greatest point of contention. One of the friends, a woman, claimed that during her check on her own little one, she had walked up the road and seen a man. She described him vividly. He was carrying a small figure. She described the figure's pajamas. She said the man was walking away from apartment 5A, heading into the darkness. This statement was explosive. It gave the police a suspect. It gave the media a phantom to hunt. But when the inspector overlaid this sighting with the statement of the father, the impossible emerged. The father had been standing in the street, talking to another friend, at the precise moment this woman claimed the abductor walked past. The street was narrow. It was well lit. For the abductor to have walked past without being seen by the 2 men standing there was physically impossible. Was the woman mistaken about the time? Was the father mistaken about his location? Or was the sighting a fabrication, a desperate attempt to provide a lead where there was none? The inspector looked at the sketch produced from the woman's description. It was generic, a blank face in the dark. Yet the description of the victim's positioning was specific. The victim was asleep, she said. Not struggling, not crying. The discrepancies grew. The food orders at the restaurant were analyzed to verify the timeline. The staff's recollection differed from the group's. The staff remembered a table that was loud, consuming large amounts of wine, and perhaps not leaving as frequently as the group claimed. The concept of the 30-minute check began to look less like a rigorous security measure and more like a retrospective justification for their absence. Then there was the issue of the front door. The parents admitted they had used the front door key earlier in the day, but had entered through the rear patio doors for the checks. This meant the front door was locked. If the abductor went out the window, why was the window not broken? If they went out the door, they would have needed a key or to unlock it from the inside. But the twins were asleep in the middle of the room. The path to the door was blocked by cots. The inspector felt the headache of inconsistency throbbing behind his eyes. In a truthful recounting of events, details often align imperfectly because human memory is flawed. But here, the main beats of the story were too polished, yet the subtle interactions were colliding. It felt rehearsed, yet poorly coordinated. The group began to close ranks even tighter. They refused to be interviewed separately again. They demanded lawyers. The inspector realized that the witnesses were behaving like suspects. They were terrified, not just of the abductor, but of the accusation of negligence. In Portugal, leaving young dependents alone is a crime. Were they lying to cover up a fatal outcome, or were they lying to cover up the fact that they had abandoned their little one for hours to get drunk? The window of opportunity for the abduction was narrowed down to a tiny sliver of time, barely 3 minutes between one friend checking and the mother discovering the empty bed. 3 minutes for a stranger to enter, select a victim, navigate the furniture, open a window, and escape unseen. It was a heist of impossible precision. The inspector looked at the timeline on his whiteboard. It was a mess of red lines and crossed-out times. The sighting of the man with the victim was the only thread leading away from the apartment, but it was a thread that tangled with the presence of the father in the street. One of them had to be wrong, and if the sighting was wrong, then the abductor vanished into thin air. If the sighting was real, then the father and his friend were blind. The truth was hiding in the silence between the seconds, and the inspector knew that breaking that silence would require more than questions. It would require breaking the unity of the group. The transformation of the small resort town from a crime scene into a global stage happened with terrifying speed. Within 48 hours of the alarm being raised, the quiet streets were choked with satellite trucks, cameramen, and journalists from every major news network on the planet. The silence that the abductor had used as cover was replaced by a deafening roar of 24-hour news cycles. For the parents, the media became a double-edged sword. On one hand, they needed the publicity. They believed that if the face of their little one was on every television screen and newspaper front page in Europe, the abductor would have nowhere to hide. They hired public relations experts, a move that was unprecedented for a missing person case. They created a campaign, a brand, utilizing a specific photograph of the missing person's eye which had a distinctive mark. They were not just fighting a crime, they were fighting for visibility in a world with a short attention span. However, the sheer volume of people descended upon the town crushed the investigation. Journalists were everywhere. They rented every available room, they interviewed every local resident, and in their hunger for a scoop, they trampled over potential evidence. They walked through the scrubland where the police should have been searching. They camped outside the apartment, their lenses trained on the windows, turning the family's grief into a reality television show. The local police were overwhelmed. They were used to dealing with petty theft and traffic accidents, not a press pack that hunted in a wolf pack. The lead detectives found themselves spending more time managing the media leaks than following leads. Every time they planned a search, the cameras were there before the officers. The element of surprise, crucial in any investigation, was lost. If the perpetrator was still in the area, they were watching the police movements in high definition on the evening news. The atmosphere shifted from shock to a strange, manic energy. The parents began to tour, visiting neighboring countries, meeting with religious leaders, and keeping the momentum going. This baffled the local authorities. In their experience, parents of missing little one were paralyzed by trauma, unable to leave the proximity of the disappearance site in case the victim was found. The mobility of the parents, their ability to stand before cameras and give articulate interviews, was interpreted by the Portuguese public not as strength, but as coldness. The cultural divide widened. The British media painted the parents as victims of an incompetent foreign police force. The Portuguese media retaliated, painting the parents as negligent tourists who considered themselves above the law. The truth was lost somewhere in the crossfire. The investigation was no longer about facts. It was about narratives. The parents were controlling the story, releasing statements, releasing balloons, creating a momentum that forced the police to allocate resources to leads that went nowhere. As weeks turned into months, the media circus began to turn on the ringmasters. The public's appetite for the grieving parents' narrative began to sour. Questions that had been whispered in the early days began to be asked loudly. Why were they not looking physically? Why were they focused on a media campaign? The cameras that had been their greatest weapon began to zoom in on their inconsistencies. The press pack, realizing the abduction theory was stalling, began to sniff the air for a new angle, and the scent they caught was one of suspicion. The investigation had hit a wall. Despite the unprecedented global awareness, despite the millions of posters and the celebrity endorsements, there was not a single shred of physical evidence to support the abduction theory. No broken glass, no footprints, no sightings that could be corroborated, and no demands for ransom. The victim had simply vanished into the ether. The lead detective, facing immense pressure to solve the case, decided to change tactics. He stopped looking for a stranger in the dark and started looking at the ground beneath his feet. He brought in specialized tools from the United Kingdom, 2 English Springer Spaniels. These were not ordinary police dogs. One was trained to detect the scent of human blood, even microscopic amounts that had been scrubbed away. The other was a victim recovery dog, trained to detect the scent of mortality. The dogs were deployed into apartment 5A. The environment was controlled. The dogs worked independently. The handler did not know the theories. He simply let the animals work. The reaction of the animals was immediate and disturbing. The victim recovery dog became agitated in the living room, barking and signaling at specific points behind the sofa and near the wardrobe. The blood dog alerted in similar areas. They moved the search to the garden, to the patio, and finally, to the rental car. The parents had hired weeks after the disappearance. The dogs alerted again. For the detectives, this was the seismic shift they had been waiting for. The dogs were not evidence in a court of law, but they were intelligence. They suggested that death had occurred in that apartment. They suggested that a body had been transported. The abduction theory, which relied on the victim being taken alive through a window, began to crumble. The working theory shifted from missing victim to homicide and concealment of a body. The status of the parents changed overnight. They were called in for questioning, but this time, the tone was different. They were no longer treated as victims to be comforted. They were declared arguidos, formal suspects. It was a legal distinction that allowed the police to ask harder questions and allowed the suspects the right to remain silent. The interrogation was a grueling endurance test. The mother sat across from the detectives, the weight of the accusations pressing down on her. They asked her 48 questions. They asked about the timeline. They asked about the blood. They asked about the behavior of the dogs. They asked why the scent of death was allegedly found on her clothing and in their car. She answered only one question. On the advice of her lawyer, she refused to answer the other 47. She sat in stone-faced silence, staring down the men who believed she was involved in her little one's disappearance. The silence in the interrogation room was heavier than the silence of the ocean. It was a wall of defense. To the police, her silence was an admission of guilt, a refusal to help find the truth. To her, it was the only shield she had left against a system she believed was trying to frame her. The father underwent a similar ordeal. The alliance between the police and the parents was shattered. The investigation was now a hostile combat zone. The police leaked the details of the dog alerts to the press, trying to break the public support for the couple. The parents' legal team fought back, discrediting the reliability of the dogs and accusing the police of fabricating a case to cover their own incompetence. The summer ended not with a resolution, but with a stalemate. The police believed they knew what had happened, but they could not prove how or where. The parents held firm to their abduction story, preparing to leave the country and return to England. As they packed their bags, they were no longer the sympathetic figures who had arrived in May. They were suspects in a fatal outcome inquiry, fleeing a country that now viewed them with deep suspicion, leaving behind an empty apartment and a mystery that was sinking deeper into the shadows. The departure of the couple from the soil of Portugal was not an exit. It was a retreat executed under the glare of 1,000 camera lenses. On the morning of the 9th of September, 2007, the legal constraints that had threatened to keep them in the country were loosened just enough to allow their passage. The status of arguido, or formal suspect, hung over them like a shroud, yet the Portuguese law did not demand their detention. It demanded only their availability, a legal tether that stretched across the continent but did not snap. The drive to the airport was a high-speed procession of tension. The vehicle carrying the parents was pursued by a cavalcade of journalists, a motorized swarm desperate for one final image of the accused leaving the scene of the alleged crime. Inside the car, the silence was absolute. The decision to leave was fraught with a specific, agonizing psychological weight. They were physically removing themselves from the last place their little one had been seen alive. To stay felt like a prison sentence, but to leave felt like an abandonment. At the airport, the chaos reached a fever pitch. The security protocols were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the press pack. Questions were shouted, accusations hurled from the back of the crowd, crossing the invisible line between reporting and prosecuting. The parents moved through the terminal with heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to engage with the circus that had consumed their lives for 4 months. They were no longer the grieving tourists appealing for help. In the eyes of the lens, they were fugitives fleeing justice, even though their flight was entirely legal. Boarding the aircraft required a dissociation from reality. As they walked down the aisle, the eyes of other passengers tracked their every movement. There was no sympathy left in the gaze of the public, only a morbid curiosity. The couple took their seats, the cabin pressure sealing them in. When the engines roared to life and the plane began its ascent, the physical sensation of lifting off the ground severed the immediate link to the search. The investigation was now thousands of feet below them, shrinking into an abstract concept rather than a daily physical struggle. Upon landing in the United Kingdom, the reception was starkly different yet equally intense. The British police, unlike their Portuguese counterparts, handled the arrival with a grim efficiency. The tarmac transfer was swift. The couple did not go into hiding immediately. Instead, they walked directly to a waiting bank of microphones to deliver a statement. The father spoke. His voice was steady, a result of the iron discipline he had forged over the summer. He declared, using words that had been carefully vetted by top-tier lawyers, that they had played no part in the disappearance of the missing girl. He emphasized that their return was not an escape, but a necessity for the well-being of their remaining little one. Meanwhile, back in the offices of the Criminal Investigation Department in Portimao, the mood was one of bitter frustration. The chief inspector watched the news footage of the plane landing in England with the knowledge that his leverage had just evaporated. With the suspects now outside Portuguese jurisdiction, the logistics of the investigation became a diplomatic nightmare. Every request for an interview, every demand for a forensic sample would now have to pass through layers of bureaucracy, slowing the pursuit of truth to a glacial pace. The files on the desk of the prosecutor were growing, yet they were filled with circumstantial smoke rather than forensic fire. The initial DNA results from the laboratory in Birmingham were returning, and they were maddeningly inconclusive. The scientists could not say with 100% certainty that the biological material found in the rental car belonged to the missing victim. The markers were there. 15 out of 19 components matched, but the science demanded precision that the degraded samples could not provide. The report used terms like moderate support and complex mixture, phrases that were scientifically accurate but legally useless in a homicide trial. The departure of the parents also triggered a fracturing of the group known as the Tapas 7. With the central figures gone, the remaining friends retreated into their own private silences. The collective front they had maintained began to dissolve under the pressure of legal threats and media intrusion. Statements were revisited. Lawyers for the friends began to negotiate terms of engagement with the police. The pact of solidarity was tested by the terrifying possibility that one of them might be accused of complicity in a crime they swore never happened. In the weeks that followed the return, The public opinion in the United Kingdom underwent a seismic shift. The initial wave of unconditional support, characterized by yellow ribbons and charity wristbands, began to recede. It was replaced by a tide of skepticism. The tabloid press, which had built the parents up as icons of tragic loss, now turned on them with ferocious intent. Editorials began to ask the hard questions that the Portuguese police had failed to answer. Why did they leave the little one alone? Why did they refuse to answer questions? The trial by media had begun, and it was far more vicious than any courtroom procedure. The parents found themselves fighting a war on two fronts. On one side, they were battling the Portuguese judicial system to clear their names and keep the search for their little one active. On the other side, they were battling a libelous press and a public that had decided they were guilty based on the behavior of sniffer dogs and the cold expressions they wore in interviews. They hired defamation lawyers. They threatened lawsuits against newspapers. They launched a counteroffensive to reclaim the narrative. But the doubt had already set in like rot. As the year 2007 drew to a close, the case entered a state of paralysis. The Portuguese Attorney General eventually archived the case, stating that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute anyone, yet explicitly stating that the parents had not been cleared. It was the worst possible outcome, a legal limbo. They were neither guilty nor innocent in the eyes of the law. They were simply unproven. The file was closed, but the suspicion remained open, a permanent stain on their reputations. The victim was still missing. In all the legal maneuvering, in all the flights and press conferences and forensic reports, the central fact remained unchanged. A little girl had vanished from a room, and despite the combined efforts of two nations, the police forces, the private detectives, and the media, not a single trace of her physical self had been found since that Thursday night. The mystery had hardened into a cold case, leaving the parents trapped in a new kind of prison, not one of metal bars, but of eternal, unresolved suspicion. The archiving of the case by the Portuguese authorities was intended to bring a definitive silence to the proceedings, but instead, it triggered a chaotic noise that reverberated across the internet. For the parents, the official closure of the investigation was a moment of profound abandonment. The state had effectively washed its hands of the mystery, declaring that they could neither prove a crime had been committed nor exonerate the suspects. It was a legal purgatory that left the couple standing alone against a world that was growing increasingly hostile. In the vacuum left by the police, the parents made a decision that would alter the trajectory of their lives forever. They would privatize the investigation. If the authorities would not look for their little one, they would pay someone who would. They established a fund, a financial reservoir filled by donations from a sympathetic public, and used it to hire private detective agencies. This shifted the dynamic from a procedural police inquiry to a mercenary operation. The new investigators were not bound by diplomatic protocols or the evidentiary standards of a court. They were bound only by the contract to find answers. However, the world of private intelligence proved to be a treacherous landscape. The first agency hired was a Spanish firm with a reputation for aggressive tactics. They promised results. They spoke of spies, of satellite imagery, and of networks that reached into the criminal networks abroad. The parents, desperate for hope, clung to these promises. They needed to believe that their little one was being held in a location that could be stormed, rather than accepting the darker, more final theories of the police. This desperation made them vulnerable. The private investigators burned through money at an alarming rate, chasing leads that evaporated upon inspection. Reports came in of sightings in Morocco, in Belgium, in Australia. Each sighting was a spike of adrenaline followed by a crushing crash of reality. The parents were forced to live on a permanent edge, waiting for a phone call that would either save them or destroy them. They were no longer just fighting for their reputation. They were fighting against the realization that they might be funding a charade. Then came the event that stripped them of all privacy before the world. The release of the police files. In a move of radical transparency, or perhaps bureaucratic spite, The Portuguese justice system released the entire case file to the public. It was a data dump of colossal proportions. Thousands of pages of witness statements, forensic reports, emails, and photographs were suddenly available to anyone with an internet connection. The privacy of the group was obliterated in an instant. For the public, this was a feast. Amateur sleuths, journalists, and critics descended upon the documents, dissecting every contradiction and every inconsistency. The tapas, 7. The friends who had stood by the couple found their words analyzed and cross-referenced by millions of strangers. The discrepancies that the chief inspector had noted in private were now public knowledge. The timelines that did not match, the changing descriptions of the night, the confusion over who checked on the little one and when it was all laid bare. For the parents, reading the files was a journey into a psychological nightmare. They saw, for the first time, the full extent of the police case against them. They read the emails between detectives discussing their guilt. They saw the raw data from the sniffer dogs, the alerts in the apartment and on the car key, presented without the mitigating context of defense lawyers. They saw the doubts of their own friends recorded in police notebooks. It was a betrayal by ink and paper. The release of the files fundamentally changed the nature of the battle. It was no longer about finding a missing person. It was a war for the narrative. The internet polarized into two distinct camps, those who believed the abduction theory and those who believed the parents were involved. The discussion boards became battlegrounds. Every piece of evidence was weaponized. The parents were forced to hire reputation managers, lawyers who specialized in libel, to fight the tide of accusations rising from the digital swamp. The strain on their personal lives was immense. They were living in a fortress of their own making, unable to step outside without fear of harassment. The private investigators they had hired began to turn on each other, leaking stories to the press about unpaid bills and disagreements over strategy. The Spanish agency was eventually fired, replaced by former British intelligence officers. But the damage was done. The public perception had shifted from sympathy to cynicism. The investigation had become an industry, a machine that consumed money and produced nothing but headlines. Amidst this chaos, the memory of the victim began to fade, replaced by the brand of the missing person. She became a poster, a pixelated image on a screen, a subject of debate rather than a human being. The parents fought to keep her humanity alive, but they were drowning in the noise. They realized that the files had not provided answers. They had only provided fuel for the fire. The truth was buried somewhere in those 30,000 pages, hidden under layers of translation errors and bureaucratic jargon. But no one could agree on what it was. The year turned, and the silence from the police remained absolute. The parents were left with a team of private detectives who had no power of arrest, no access to official databases, and no authority to interview suspects. They were playing detective in a real-world game where the stakes were life and death, and they were losing. The hope that had sustained them in the early days was hardening into a grim determination, a refusal to let the story end with a question mark. But deep down, in the quiet moments when the lawyers stopped talking and the media cycle paused, the terrifying thought took root. Perhaps the police were right, and there was no one out there to find. The summer of 2008 brought a legal decree that should have been a liberation, but felt more like an amputation. The Portuguese Attorney General announced the official archiving of the investigation. In the dry, bureaucratic language of the state, the status of Arguido was lifted from the parents. They were no longer formal suspects in the eyes of the law. The restrictions on their movement, the threat of imminent prosecution, and the shadow of the Portuguese prison system vanished with the stroke of a pen. However, the closure was hollow. The report stated explicitly that the lifting of the suspect status was not a declaration of innocence, but rather a result of insufficient evidence to prove guilt. It was a distinction that mattered little to the law, but meant everything to the court of public opinion. The police had not found the victim, nor had they found proof of her death. They had simply run out of road. The parents were left standing in the ruins of the investigation, cleared of charges but not cleared of suspicion. Just as they attempted to rebuild their lives and refocus the search on the abduction theory, a new adversary emerged from the ashes of the police inquiry. The former chief inspector, the man who had looked into their eyes in the interrogation room and believed they were lying, released a book. He had resigned from the force, shedding his badge but not his conviction. His book was a direct, frontal, serious offense on the parents' narrative. It laid out, in forensic detail, the police thesis that the victim had died in the apartment and that a sophisticated cover-up had taken place. The publication of this book was a detonation. It became an instant bestseller in Portugal, flying off the shelves faster than bookstores could stock it. For the parents, the existence of this text was not just an insult, it was an active threat to the search. They argued that if the public believed the victim was deceased, no one would look for her. They believed the book was a poison that would paralyze the investigation forever. They decided to strike back. They launched a massive legal action to ban the book and silence the former detective. The courtroom became the new arena of conflict. It was a war of words, fought with injunctions, appeals, and libel laws. The parents sought to crush the distribution of the text, to seize the profits, and to gag the man who had become their nemesis. The legal battle was visceral. Lawyers for the parents argued that the freedom of speech did not extend to the destruction of reputation and the sabotage of a missing persons search. They stood before judges and described the agony of the parents, forcing them to relive the trauma as they dissected the detective's claims. They argued that the book was a work of fiction masquerading as fact, a collection of unproven theories designed to humiliate a grieving family. On the other side, the former detective stood defiant. He argued that he had a right to defend his professional reputation. He claimed that the investigation had been truncated by political interference and that the public had a right to know the conclusions he had reached before the files were closed. He positioned himself as a whistleblower, a lone voice of truth against a powerful international machinery. The trial was a grinding, exhausting process. Witnesses were called to testify about the reliability of the evidence. The sniffer dogs were discussed again, their barks and alerts debated by experts who had never set foot in the apartment. The DNA results, those inconclusive fragments of biology, were re-examined. The courtroom felt like a time machine, dragging everyone back to the night of the 3rd of May, trapping them in a loop of analysis and counter-analysis. For the parents, the process was a psychological torture. They had to sit and listen as lawyers read excerpts from the book, passages that described in graphic detail the hypothetical death of their little one. They had to maintain their composure while their character was assassinated on the stand. They were fighting to silence a narrative, but in doing so, they were inadvertently amplifying it. Every day the trial continued. The contents of the book were reported in newspapers around the world. The Streisand effect took hold. The more they tried to suppress the theory, the more people wanted to read it. The judge eventually granted a temporary injunction. The book was pulled from shelves. A victory, it seemed, had been won. But it was a fragile victory. The ban was later overturned on appeal, with higher courts prioritizing freedom of expression over the right to reputation. The book returned to circulation, and with it, the shadow over the parents deepened. The financial cost of this war was staggering. The fund, established to find the victim, was now hemorrhaging money into legal fees. Donors began to question why their contributions were being used to sue a retired policeman in Lisbon rather than to hunt for kidnappers in North Africa or Europe. The moral clarity of the early days was gone. The search for the victim had been eclipsed by the search for vindication. As the months turned into years, the parents realized that they were trapped in a paradox. They had won their freedom from the Portuguese legal system, but they were prisoners of the counter-narrative. The detective's theory had taken root in the public consciousness. It had spawned documentaries, internet forums, and discussion groups dedicated to proving the parents' guilt. The files of silence were no longer silent. They were screaming. The parents retreated to their home, the legal battles having drained them of energy and resources. They had fought the police, the media, and the detective, and they were still standing. But the room in their house remained empty. The bed remained unslept in. The victory in the courtroom felt cold and meaningless against the immense, crushing reality of the absence. The war of words had been fought to a stalemate, but the war to find the truth had barely begun, and the battlefield was now global, chaotic, and infinitely more difficult to navigate. The silence that had settled over the case was not a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a locked room. For years, the files lay gathering dust in the archives of the Portuguese judiciary, a monument to unsolved sorrow. The parents, however, refused to let the silence become permanent. They understood that in the absence of new evidence, the only force that could restart the machinery of justice was political will. They moved their campaign from the television studios to the corridors of power, lobbying ministers and government officials with a singular, relentless message. A British citizen had been stolen, and the state had a duty to find her. In the spring of 2011, their persistence breached the wall of bureaucratic inertia. The Home Secretary, under pressure from a powerful media campaign and a direct appeal from the parents, ordered a review of the case. It was an unprecedented move. The Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard, was tasked with re-examining every scrap of paper, every witness statement, and every forensic report that had been generated since the night of the 3rd of May. This was not merely a favor. It was a resurrection. The operation, codenamed Grange, began in a secure facility in London. It was a forensic archaeology of the highest order. The detectives were not hunting a fresh trail. They were digging through the strata of a 4-year-old investigation that had been plagued by errors, leaks, and cultural misunderstandings. Their first task was translation. 40,000 pages of Portuguese documents had to be converted into English, a task that revealed the sheer scale of the disjointed information. As the British detectives pieced the puzzle back together, they found that the original timeline, the backbone of the entire investigation, was fractured. The initial inquiry had relied heavily on a specific sighting by one of the friends, a description of a man carrying a victim away from the apartment at 9:15. This sighting had anchored the police theory for years. It had dictated the search radius, the roadblocks, and the suspects. However, the new team made a breakthrough that shattered this assumption. By cross-referencing holiday records and interviewing other tourists who had been at the resort, they identified the man seen carrying the victim. He was not an abductor. He was an innocent British father, returning his own family member to bed from the night service. He had been walking in the wrong place at the wrong time, and his silhouette had been mistaken for a monster. The implications of this discovery were seismic. If the 9:15 sighting was innocent, then the abduction had not happened then. The window of opportunity shifted. The timeline expanded. The abductor had not slipped past the father of the missing girl in the street. The abductor had likely struck later, closer to 10 o'clock. The entire premise of the earlier investigation collapsed, and with it, the alibis and assumptions that had protected the true perpetrator. This shift in the timeline revitalized the case. It meant that the Smith citing a report of a man carrying a small blonde figure toward the beach around 10 o'clock, which had been largely ignored, suddenly became the primary lead. The detectives generated new computer-generated images of this man. They were not looking for a ghost anymore. They were looking for a specific individual who fit a new, corroborated profile. The tension between the British team and their Portuguese counterparts was palpable. The review was, by its very nature, a critique of the initial investigation. Every error identified by Scotland Yard was a diplomatic slight. Yet, the necessity of cooperation forced a fragile truce. Letters of request were sent back and forth between London and Lisbon. Legal treaties invoked to allow British officers to walk the streets of the resort once more. For the parents, this period was a torture of renewed hope. They had to watch as the police publicly dismantled the theories that had haunted them. The British authorities officially declared that there was no evidence to suggest the parents were involved. It was the exoneration they had fought for in the courts, finally granted by the highest level of law enforcement. But vindication did not bring their little one back. It only cleared the debris so the search could begin again. The investigation moved into a new, aggressive phase. The detectives began to look at a pattern of burglaries in the area prior to the disappearance. They found a disturbing sequence of intrusions, where a man had entered holiday apartments, not to steal valuables, but to watch the occupants sleeping. It was a predator's behavior, escalating in risk and proximity. The theory shifted from a random, opportunistic snatch to a calculated act by a local offender or a drifter who knew the layout of the resort intimately. Mass excavation was ordered. In the summer of 2014, the scrubland surrounding the resort, the same land that had been trampled by journalists and tourists 7 years prior, was sealed off. Heavy machinery moved in. The ground was stripped back, layer by layer, sifted by forensic anthropologists. The parents waited in England, their phones by their sides, dreading the ring that would tell them a body had been found, yet desperate for the ring that would end the uncertainty. The dig yielded nothing of significance. No bones, no clothing, no toy. The earth had kept its secrets. The anticlimax was devastating. The operation had cost millions of pounds, and while it had cleared the parents and corrected the timeline, it had failed to deliver the physical proof needed to close the case. The critics in the press and the public began to voice their dissent louder than ever. They called it a waste of taxpayer money, a futile exercise in chasing shadows. Yet, deep within the files of the new investigation, a name had surfaced. It was a name that had been overlooked in the chaos of the early days. A German national, a drifter living in a camper van near the resort, a man with a history of crimes that chilled the blood of the detectives who read his file. He had been there. His phone had pinged off a mast near the apartment on the night of the disappearance. And then, the next day, he had re-registered his vehicle in another name. The focus narrowed. The vast, sprawling mess of the investigation began to tighten like a noose around this single new suspect. The detectives knew they were running out of time. Witnesses were dying, memories were fading, and the suspect was currently sitting in a prison cell for another crime. His silence a fortress that would be harder to breach than any physical evidence. The game of cat and mouse had resumed. But this time, the cat was old, scarred, and desperate to catch the mouse before the clock stopped forever. The investigation, which had laid dormant like a sleeping beast for years, awoke with a roar in the summer of 2020. The focus had shifted entirely from the parents and their circle of friends to a singular figure sitting in a prison cell in northern Germany. This new suspect was not a ghost or a phantom sighting. He was a tangible, terrifying reality with a criminal record that read like a roadmap of predation. The German prosecutors, known for their stoic precision, made a startling announcement that reverberated across the continent. They believed the missing victim was dead, and they believed they knew who had tragic end her. The suspect was a drifter, a man who had lived on the fringes of society in the Algarve during the critical years. He lived in a camper van, a mobile existence that allowed him to move unseen between the chaotic tourist towns and the desolate scrubland. To the detectives, his profile was a perfect storm of opportunity and capability. He was a man who survived by burglary and drug dealing, a man who knew the layout of the holiday resorts better than the tourists who inhabited them. The breakthrough had not come from forensic science, but from the loose tongue of the suspect himself. Years prior, in a bar on the anniversary of the disappearance, he had allegedly made a comment to an acquaintance. As images of the missing victim flashed on a television screen, he had muttered words that implied intimate knowledge of her fate. It was a drunken boast, a moment of arrogance where the need to feel powerful overrode the instinct for self-preservation. That acquaintance had eventually gone to the police, providing the spark that ignited the German inquiry. For the parents, this development was a psychological sledgehammer. For 13 years, they had clung to the hope of a reunion, fueling their search with the belief that absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. Now, they were receiving letters from a German prosecutor stating, with professional detachment, that their little one had been fatal outcome. However, the prosecutor withheld the evidence that led to this conclusion, citing the integrity of the ongoing investigation. The parents were asked to accept the death of their missing loved one based on the word of a stranger, without being given the proof to mourn. The legal battle that ensued was a complex game of chess played across 3 jurisdictions. The German police needed to keep the suspect incarcerated. He was nearing the end of a sentence for a separate drug trafficking offense. If he was released, he would likely vanish again, disappearing into the porous borders of Europe. The prosecutors frantically worked to dredge up old cases, cold cases of serious physical offenses in Portugal, to build a wall of charges that would keep him behind bars while they finalized the fatal outcome case against him. Inside the interrogation rooms, the dynamic was tense. The suspect maintained a wall of silence. He was a career criminal, hardened by years in the penal system. He knew that without a body and without a confession, a fatal outcome conviction was incredibly difficult to secure. He taunted the investigators with his refusal to engage. His lawyers attacked the credibility of the witnesses, painting the acquaintance from the bar as a liar seeking a reward. They argued that the police were desperate to solve the world's most famous missing person case and had pinned it on the most convenient scapegoat they could find. The investigation moved to the physical remnants of the suspect's life. Police seized the camper van and a second vehicle, a Jaguar, which had been re-registered the day after the victim vanished. They tore these vehicles apart, looking for a microscopic link, a hair, a fiber, a trace of DNA that had survived 13 years of cleaning and usage. The forensic teams worked with the pressure of the world on their shoulders, knowing that a single match could close the case, while a negative result would leave it in purgatory. Meanwhile, the media storm returned with a ferocity that rivaled the early days. The face of the German suspect was plastered on every front page. Documentaries were commissioned overnight. Journalists descended on the small German town where he had lived, interviewing neighbors who described a man who kept to himself, a man with a short fuse. The narrative of the negligent parents was finally replaced by the narrative of the monster in the van. The public anger, which had been directed at the couple for so long, found a new target. Yet, despite the confidence of the German authorities, the charges did not materialize immediately. Month after month passed. The concrete evidence the prosecutor alluded to remained hidden. Critics began to whisper that the Germans had overplayed their hand. Had they announced the solution before they had the proof? The specter of another failed investigation loomed large. The British police remained cautious, refusing to categorize the case as a fatal outcome inquiry, continuing to treat it as a missing person case until definitive proof was provided. The parents existed in a state of suspended animation. They were trapped between the British police, who offered hope, and the German police, who offered closure. They had to navigate this contradiction daily, waking up not knowing if they were searching for a survivor or seeking justice for a deceased one. The emotional toll was incalculable. Every time the phone rang, the adrenaline spiked, the fear that this was the call confirming the end. As the year ended, the suspect remained in his cell, fighting extradition and appealing sentences. He was a spider in the center of a legal web, motionless but dangerous. The detectives outside were circling, trying to find the one loose thread that would unravel his defense. They dug into his past, tracing his movements through phone logs that placed him near the apartment on that fateful night. The technology of 2007 was archaic compared to 2020, but the digital footprints remained, ghostly echoes of a man stalking the shadows of a resort while parents dined and little ones slept. The net was tightening, but the final knot had yet to be tied. As the calendar turned toward the spring of 2022, a new and terrifying enemy emerged in the investigation: time itself. In the Portuguese legal system, justice has an expiration date. The statute of limitations for crimes carrying a sentence of more than 10 years, such as homicide, stands at exactly 15 years. This meant that on the 3rd of May, 2022, the ability to prosecute anyone for the disappearance of the victim would legally cease to exist. If no formal suspect was named before that date, the case would not just go cold, it would die a permanent, bureaucratic death. The pressure inside the offices of the detectives in Faro and Portimao was immense. They were caught in a paralyzing bind. The German prosecutors, who held the suspect and the supposed evidence, had still not brought formal charges. They were methodically building their case, refusing to be rushed by a calendar date in another country. However, the Portuguese authorities knew that if they waited for the Germans to finish, the 15-year clock would run out, and the suspect would walk free from any potential prosecution in Portugal, regardless of what evidence was later found. The tension was a physical weight on the parents. For 15 years, they had fought against silence, against libel, and against apathy. Now, they were fighting a stopwatch. They faced the harrowing prospect that the man the police believed was responsible might evade justice simply because a paperwork deadline had passed. It was a cruel irony that after fighting for so long to keep the case open, it might be closed by a technicality designed to protect the legal system from ancient grievances. Days before the deadline, in late April, the Portuguese authorities made their move. In a strategic legal maneuver, they officially named the German prisoner an arguido. It was the same status that had been applied to the parents themselves in the dark days of 2007, a label that carried the weight of suspicion and the restriction of rights. This time, however, the designation was a tactical necessity. By declaring him a formal suspect, they effectively stopped the clock. The statute of limitations was paused, keeping the legal window open and allowing the investigation to continue. The reaction from the suspect's defense team was immediate and scathing. From his cell in Germany, the suspect issued denials through his lawyers, dismissing the move as a desperate procedural trick. They argued that there was no new evidence to justify the status, that it was merely a way to appease the public and the parents before the anniversary. The suspect portrayed himself as a victim of a system that needed a villain, a convenient target to pin a 15-year-old mystery upon. For the parents, the news brought a complex storm of emotions. The term arguido was a word that had scarred their lives, a word associated with their own persecution. To hear it applied to the man suspected of harming their little one was a grim satisfaction, but it was not a solution. It was a holding pattern. It did not mean he was charged. It did not mean he would face trial. It only meant that the door had not been slammed shut. The investigation had now mutated into a purely legalistic struggle. The physical search for the victim had long since ceased. There were no more digs, no more sniffer dogs, no more posters being handed out on beaches. The search was now taking place in file servers and evidence lockers. The British police continued to fund their Operation Grange, but the budget was being trimmed. The team reduced to a skeleton crew. They were maintaining a watching brief, waiting for the German prosecutor to play his hand. The German prosecutor remained the enigma at the center of the deadlock. He gave interviews in which he expressed absolute certainty that the suspect was the perpetrator, yet he refused to reveal the concrete evidence he claimed to possess. This silence began to corrode public confidence. Was the evidence a smoking gun, or was it a house of cards? Legal experts speculated that the evidence might be circumstantial cell phone tower pings, confessions to friends, a history of similar crimes, but lacked the forensic DNA link that would make a conviction inevitable. As the 15th anniversary passed, the case entered a strange, zombie-like state. It was technically active, yet practically frozen. The suspect remained in prison for other crimes, effectively neutralized but legally innocent of the disappearance. The parents were left in a limbo that was deeper and darker than before. They were no longer fighting for awareness. They were waiting for a prosecutor in a foreign land to decide if he had enough to go to trial. The psychological toll of this endless waiting was the true cost of the crime. The parents had to wake up every morning and function, to work, to raise their other little one, all while carrying the unseen burden of the unresolved. They were trapped in a narrative that refused to end. The media interest had waned, shifting to newer tragedies, leaving them alone with the legal documents and the silence of the telephone. With every year that passed, memories faded, witnesses died, and the truth became harder to extract from the past. The parents knew that the legal victory of stopping the clock was meaningless if it did not lead to a trial. They were still standing on the edge of the cliff, looking into the dark, waiting for someone to turn on a light that might never come. In the spring of 2023, the investigation erupted into physical action once more, shattering the quiet stalemate of the legal proceedings. The focus of the inquiry shifted 50 kilometers away from the coastal resort, moving inland to a remote body of water that the German suspect had once referred to as his little paradise. The German prosecutors, acting on intelligence that had been carefully corroborated over months, requested a search of the Arade Dam. It was not a routine check. It was the largest search operation conducted in the case for nearly a decade. The logistics of the operation were military in scale. The peninsula was sealed off. Heavy police vehicles from 3 nations converged on the site. The Portuguese police, the German federal investigators, and the liaison officers from Scotland Yard stood together on the muddy banks, a visual representation of the international alliance that now drove the hunt. They did not come with questions. They came with shovels, rakes, and pickaxes. They were looking for something specific, something that the suspect might have left behind in the sanctuary he frequented during his drifting years. The search began with a brutal efficiency. The undergrowth was cleared not by nature, but by men with machetes and chainsaws, stripping the earth bare to reveal its secrets. Specialized divers entered the murky water, their movements guided by sonar, feeling blindly in the silt for objects that did not belong. The noise of the operation was deafening, the roar of generators, the shouting of orders, the mechanical grind of excavation. It was a violent disruption of the silence, a desperate attempt to force the land to give up a ghost. For the parents, the news of the search was a visceral shock. They were back in the headlines, back in the center of the storm. Every news channel in Europe was broadcasting live from the perimeter of the reservoir. The images of police officers digging in the dirt were a painful echo of the searches conducted in 2014. The hope that something would be found was inextricably linked to the horror of what that discovery would mean. To find evidence here would likely mean finding the end of the story, a tragic finality that they had spent 16 years fighting against. The German prosecutor remained stoic. He released brief, clipped statements confirming that the search was connected to the suspect, but he refused to elaborate on what exactly they were looking for. This secrecy fueled the speculation. Had they found photographs? Had a witness come forward with a specific location? The media frenzy was intense, with journalists speculating about pink pajamas and buried bags, turning the forensic operation into a macabre treasure hunt. For 3 days, the police scourged the area. They dug holes in the hard, dry earth. They sifted through piles of soil. On the final day, bags of evidence were carried away. They were not body bags. They were small, sealed containers holding items that looked like rags, pieces of plastic, and other detritus of human presence. The police did not display them. They loaded them into unmarked vans and drove them away to be analyzed in high-tech laboratories in Germany. The end of the search brought a familiar, suffocating silence. The tents were packed away. The police tape was removed. The media caravans moved on to the next story. The parents were left in the void, waiting for the results of the forensic testing. The German authorities warned that the analysis could take weeks, perhaps months. They had to determine if the scraps of fabric or the soil samples contained any biological link to the missing person or the suspect. As the weeks turned into months, the results remained classified. The prosecutor gave no updates. The hope that the reservoir would provide the smoking gun began to fade, replaced by the gnawing fear that it was another dead end. The items found were likely just trash, the discarded refuse of campers and fishermen, unrelated to the crime of the century. The suspect, safe in his cell, reportedly laughed at the efforts, dismissing the search as a desperate stunt by a prosecution team that had no case. However, the operation served a different purpose. It demonstrated the resolve of the investigators. It showed that after 16 years, they were still willing to tear up the earth to find the truth. It sent a message to the suspect that he was being watched, that his past was being dismantled piece by piece. The parents took a grim comfort in this. The world had not moved on. The police had not forgotten. The search for their little one was no longer a sprint. It was a war of attrition. And as long as there were stones left to turn, the detectives would turn them. The evidence from the reservoir sat in a lab, under a microscope, silent and ambiguous. The parents remained in their home, caught in the eternal loop of the investigation. They had survived the accusations, the libel, the false sightings, and the failed searches. Now, they had to survive the hope that the reservoir had given them, a hope that was as dangerous as it was necessary. The water had settled, the mud had dried, but the question remained unanswered, floating in the darkness like a buoy in a storm.